Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's noon lecture series presentation. My name is Reginald Jackson, and I'm director of the Center for Japanese Studies, and I am very glad and proud to have Professor Ann Sherif, who will be talking to us today. So as you see here, there's a notice. If you could please understand that the cameras and microphones have been disabled for this webinar, but if you'd like to type in questions related to the presentation, you can do that in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We've also turned on live captioning for the duration of this event. But be aware that this feature is not always accurate. So today we're pleased to have Professor Ann Sherif, who is a professor of East Asian Studies at Oberlin College, talking to us today. Her title is Art and Activism in Post-War Japan, the Anti-War Art of Shikoku Gorō. And Professor Sherif, besides being an alum of the University of Michigan, which makes us very proud indeed, has had a very distinguished career in the field of Asian studies. She took her PhD in Japanese literature from the University of Michigan after completing an MA in Asian languages and cultures at the University of Michigan and a BA in Asian studies at Indiana University, and has also done coursework at the University Center for Japanese Studies. She's been a professor at Oberlin College for some years now, and as well as serving as a visiting faculty fellow at the Associated Kyoto program, for which I'm actually nostalgic from my undergraduate days. And has also served as a translator for the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, as well as NHK. She's received numerous grants and awards, most recently a grant from the Mellon Digital Humanities for this project, Popular Protest in Post-War Japan, about which she'll be speaking to us today. She's also received grants from the Luce Foundation, the Japan Foundation, and the Japan-United States Friendship Commission. Professor Sherif has also published monographs, including Mirror, the Essays and Fiction of Kolda Aya in 1999, and more recently, the really great book, Japan's Cold War, Media, Literature, and the Law from Columbia University Press in 2009. She's also published several articles, most recently including Greening Atomic Bomb Survivor Trees, Ecological Literacy, and ENGOs as liaison institutional partners, and Politics and the Culture of Fascism in Literature Among the Ruins. So any look at Professor Sherif's CV will show that she's a very productive scholar with interests in things like Cold War culture, post-war literature, film, cultural production, and we're very lucky to have her with us talking today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Sherif.
Hello, everyone. I'm really honored and delighted to be here at my alma mater, even though I'm in the state of Michigan right now, and the fierce rivalry between Ohio State University and University of Michigan, the football rivalry, will not happen for the first time in 103 years. But we're all friends anyway. So thank you all for joining me. I see that there are many friends and students and colleagues in the audience. Hello for those of you who are joining us from Japan, and thank you for staying up so late at night, perhaps in your pajamas, and the rest of you, I hope you'll enjoy your lunch here in North America. Although my name is listed as author of the online exhibit that I will discuss today, I just wanted to preface my talk by saying this online digital website was definitely a team effort. So I'd like to give a special shout out to my colleagues at Oberlin College Libraries, especially the staff members Megan Mitchell and Cecilia Robinson, and also a former student, Oberlin alumni, Max Mitchell, and also to the many people, many of you are here, who've given me feedback and support on this project. So now I will get started with my talk. I'd besides football, in addition to football, one of the things that we're all worried about today in the midst of this pandemic is democracy. Is democracy fragile? How resilient is our democracy? Challenges to democracy are not new, nor is the hard work of strengthening democracy, central to which is an informed and committed citizenry, each one of us as informed and committed citizens. Now, and as in the past, the arts are at the center of the project of strengthening and defining democracy. The digital exhibit that I will introduce today is a case study of activist artist Shikoku Gorō, who lived from 1924 to 2014. And Shikoku's strategic employment of the arts in order to be an agent of social change and a steward of democracy. From the late 1940s to the 1990s, Shikoku used his arts to speak out for nuclear disarmament, to protest against wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, to advocate for the rights and welfare of hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, and disenfranchised minorities, to educate people about the post-war constitution and the importance of voting, to critique imperialism, capitalism, and fascism. In his hometown, Hiroshima, Shikoku was well known and loved as a cultural figure because he made visible a vibrant city and gave voice to those on the margins. In our time together today over lunch, I will offer an overview of a new digital exhibit, Arts and Activism in Post-War Japan, that focuses on Shikoku's works. My larger goals in this online exhibit, this website, are twofold. One, to examine the ways that artists adapt their art activism in response to shifting historical conditions and changing audiences. And two, to broaden the fields of post-war literature and visual arts to encompass such non-commercial, non-canonical activist art. What artistic strategies did Shikoku employ to sustain himself as an activist, despite the obstacles to his goals, despite the obstacles to getting rid of nuclear weapons, despite the slow pace of social and medical support for hibakusha, and despite the anti-democratic tendencies evident in post-war Japan? In this online website, and you see the landing page here, it's on the Oberlin College Library's website. In this online site, we look locally outside of the center at the uses of art and literature aimed at bettering society. Committed citizens in a democracy vote. We march in the streets and we make our voices heard. Such democratic citizens also make art because the arts can spark empathy and awareness, forge an emotional connection to neighbors and to strangers. The arts make visible systemic injustices and strengthen civic commitment and feelings of efficacy. Shikoku's career as an artist exemplifies persistence, to borrow a concept that Charlotte Eubanks has talked about recently. Persistence, that is, not going away, not giving up, not dropping your interest in politics once the election is done, talking to ourselves here. Persistence in creative acts that lead to change, but always conscious of our positionality and our privilege. This exhibit offers a wealth of high-resolution images of Shikoku Gorō's works, drawings, oil paintings, watercolors, poems, essays, and books, along with photographs of historical settings and his collaborators. The text provides analysis and contextualizes his works. Almost all of the images I show today are ones featured in the digital exhibit, and I include some screenshots like this one from the digital exhibit. So sometimes you'll see text in English, and that's an example of the exhibit. The exhibit can be visited casually, as you might a museum exhibit. It can be adapted for classroom use or use in research. And there's an abundance of primary sources here that are available around the world. The digital exhibit is structured around 3 books to which Shikoku Gorō contributed. Atomic Bomb Poetry, 1951, The Angry Jizo, 1979, and Hiroshima Sketches, 1985. These books are presented chronologically and are shown in the exhibit as physical objects. The earliest book, Genbaku Shishu, on the left, Atomic Bomb Poetry, which was published in September 1951, includes the poems of the renowned Hiroshima poet Hiroshima poet Toge Sankichi, and illustrations and cover by Shikoku Gorō. We see here on the left the cover of the first edition of this very famous book. In the middle is Angry Jizo, Okori Jizo, 1979, a children's picture book with text by Yamaguchi Yuko and Numata Yoichi, and cover and illustrations by Shikoku Gorō. On the right, you'll see a beat up cover edition. That's my own copy here of Hiroshima Sketches from 1985, a paperback combining images and essays about famous sites, but also about ordinary places in the city of Hiroshima. Shikoku painted the watercolor images and wrote the text. To differing degrees, the 3 books address the atomic bombings of August 1945, the unmanageable moment of state-sanctioned violence during a war when such violence had become the norm, a time of human and environmental loss and destruction, the end of a world war, the beginning of our nuclear age. The books also emphasize hope, the importance of knowing history, and describe democratic citizens who speak up. Shikoku Gorō created these books, but he also believed that the creative process itself contributes to shaping informed citizens with democratic consciousness. In conceiving of this online exhibit, one of my goals was to present the books as books, their materiality and their physicality, since a digital exhibit tends to flatten all images to 2 dimensions and to the size of whatever screen we happen to be looking at. The emphasis on materiality of the books also highlights the idea of book objects as democratic, as egalitarian in their portability and their mobility. The physical form of books, furthermore, tells us a great deal about the times when they were made and read and how the books were used. The exhibit therefore examines these elements of each book: the format, design, materiality, and content. I provide extensive historical context and emphasize Shikoku's collaboration with other activists and artists rather than his singularity. In making these books, Shikoku worked in distinct and powerful ways to reach his audiences in their own times and positions. In the online exhibit, furthermore, I also look at the ways these powerful books continue to resonate with readers and audiences today in 2020. Although Shikoku was largely self-trained, and he did not go to art schools in Tokyo, which was the dream of young artists of his generation in the 20s and 30s. His family was very poor, and there were wars going on in the 30s and 40s. Shikoku adopted the habits and disciplines of professional artists. Working outside the art establishment and the art literary marketplace, Shikoku painted in oil and watercolor, drew with ink and charcoal, wrote poetry and essays. He wrote frankly that he persisted in his expressive activities with political and ethical goals in mind. Art for him was a tool, it was a weapon. Quote, "People may criticize my lack of artistic technique and skill, but to me, art is a means of moving people to action." In the digital exhibit and in a larger research project, I employ a range of methods to analyze Shikoku's mode of democratic engagement through the arts. I consider Shikoku's work socially by looking at social formations and affiliations that were essential to his art making. Specifically, Shikoku pursued egalitarian modes of collaboration with other artists and citizens. Second, I situate Shikoku's works historically and spatially, looking at the ways he used images and text to maintain a grounding in place and space in the periphery of the nation state. Through a combination of text and images, he narrates the layered space of Hiroshima, connecting place with historical change. Finally, the digital exhibit interrogates Shikoku's aesthetic and formal practice by delineating the concepts of art as weapon and of the discipline of drawing and writing as central to the development of revolutionary conscience, democratic conscience, and of citizenship. Let us now look at the 3 books in the exhibit in a bit more detail. The first book, Atom Bomb Poetry, occupies the largest portion of the exhibit and will also be the focus of my talk today. The book we see here, this first edition of Atomic Bomb Poetry from 1951, and I know many of you in the audience think this is the end of the Allied occupation of Japan. Shikoku made this in collaboration with the famous poet Toge Sankichi, a Hiroshima native who had survived the bombing. And in the website, I include a number of translations of Toge's poems from Richard Meniere's wonderful book, Hiroshima, 3 Witnesses. In this photograph from 1950, we see Toge, the poet, in the lower left-hand corner with a group of the Cultural Circle group, Our Poems, that I'll talk more about later. And some of you might also recognize the very famous artists, the Marukis, Maruki Toshi and Maruki Iri over there to the right. As the nuclear arms race heated up in the early 1950s, Hiroshima and Nagasaki poets were increasingly called upon or took it upon themselves to speak out against nuclear weapons. In many of the poems in this book, Toge does not hold back and employs graphic and disturbing imagery to evoke the physical, emotional, and ethical violence of the atom bomb and of the war that it was part of. At the same time, Toge includes a number of poems that evoke very human and relatable voices of rage, ikari, and commitment, such as the famous and often translated "Give Me Back Father," Chichi o kaise, Ningen o kaise. This is a page from the book with that very, very famous and often translated poem that is also engraved on a stone monument in Hiroshima's Peace Park. Still, other poems describe protest in the streets of Hiroshima and the cityscape, such as the famous shadow on the stone steps. Toge's poems about death, mutilation, radiation poisoning, and nuclear weapons reveal a type of realism that bluntly represents the pain of others, not voyeuristically, but with the ethical aim of promoting empathy, understanding, and attitude change. Even with these more palatable poems mixed in, how do you get people to read a book about nuclear weapons and death? This first edition of Atomic Bomb Poetry was so successful, in fact, locally in Hiroshima, that a Tokyo publisher picked it up and the literary establishment took Toge's poem up for critique in Tokyo. How did Shikoku and Toge create this book object that so successfully reached their audiences? The format and materiality of Atomic Bomb Poetry tells us a great deal. Shikoku, the illustrator and designer, knew he had to touch readers on emotional and aesthetic levels in order to get them to engage at all with a book like this, much less with the ethical and political issues. This photo shows the small size, and on the website I included photographs of people holding, thank you, to the Shikoku family of holding these books, so we could understand how large they are in relation to the human body. So it's a rather small book. It has a distinctive rectangular format that, a distinctive rectangular format. And Shikoku also chose, as you can see, a contemporary color pattern. This is palette. This is mid-century modern colors, right? And a somewhat abstract, unsettling, and yet interesting and approachable cover design. In other words, Shikoku designed a book that was aesthetically interesting and an object that the reader could engage with intimately and maybe covertly if need be. Hide it in your pocket. They used a form of low-tech mimeographic printing, gariban, no electricity needed. By taking the control of the means of production and design of this first edition into their own hands, they could fly beneath the radar, stay underground. The book was designed, printed, and distributed in Hiroshima toward the end of the Allied occupation when censorship had lightened, but the authorities were still on alert. This is a screenshot from the actual exhibit, which is why the text is there. So this, if you look at the exhibit, you'll see this, and then you'll see a navigation button at the bottom. So the contrast between the modernistic and abstract cover, and then this is a picture of the inside cover, are analogous to Togei's placing the appealing and non-specific "Give Me Back My Father" poem on the page before the shocking and graphic atomic bomb poems. Shikoku illustrates the inside of the front and the back cover, seen here, with gut-wrenching line drawings, crude even, hurried even, that depict within their urgency injured children and adults, corpses, and they're interspersed with text that explains the scene, the date of the bombing, August 6th, and a specific place name, Funai-richo in Hiroshima. In the exhibit, I emphasize the collaborative groups and networks of people with whom Togei and Shikoku collaborated and made this book. They were both members of a circle, a cultural circle, a group called Our Poems, Warera no Uta, and the kanji on the right is, yes, red uta in this case. The Our Poems groups also participated together in public protest. They made their own journal, and we have the cover right here. And we can see from this cover image that the value they placed on labor, on laborers, on work, and trying to center women as well. Shikoku designed this Our Poem journal cover. In turn, the Our Poem Circle constituted a node in a much broader nationwide culture circle movement. I won't go into details about this broader research project of the culture circle movement today. I'll be glad to talk about it in question and answer. But I would like to briefly note that the Our Poem Circle shared many characteristics of culture circles in other regions of Japan around this same period in the early 1950s. As Justin Jesty has written, the culture circles constituted an important thread of democratic culture that evolved as part of post-war democracy. The cultures circles had in common, one, social formations that were inclusive and egalitarian and rejected the hierarchy of the elite literary and arts establishments. Two, practice centering on action in public space and mobile expressive arts, and taking the means of production into their own hands. And three, sustainability through fluid formation and dissolution, along with resilience and shifting political, media, historical, and aesthetic environments. The Our Poems group in Hiroshima engaged in poetry writing and journal making and protest for many reasons, political reasons, memorial reasons, emotional reasons, therapeutic reasons. And here's a picture of the group, the young Our Poems Circle, the group. You can see Togei Sankichi in the lower right, and he's one of the older members of the group. It was a group of young people, and most of them, the members of the group, were hibakusha, or survivors of the atomic bombing. They were not professional writers like Togei, and the circle itself became their classroom to learn about and practice poetry as an expressive means. Togei, as an established poet, did mentor the younger members of the group, as did Shikoku, but the group was very egalitarian in its approach and structure. Notably, the circle attracted a number of women participants, putting into practice the gender equity featured in the new post-war constitution. The site features one of Hayashi Sachiko's poems, and she's seen here in the lower right, Hiroshima no Sora, the sky of Hiroshima. The speaker of this haunting poem is a girl who is grappling with the loss of her mother in the bombing. Hayashi's poems appeared along with those of other members in the Circle's journal. Another notable example of the Circle's public action is the young members working together with Toge and Shikoku at their center in a street poems posters project. In Japanese, it's called Tsujishi. Shikoku designed word and image posters like this one by combining his own illustrations or graphic elements. This one happens to be a collage with poetry written by Toge, some poetry by other members of the Circle, and some of the street poem posters had featured poems by foreign leftist poets such as Aragon or Nazim Hikmet. Shikoku switched up the design of each Tsujishi, sometimes using collage, sometimes painting, and for one poster, he inked his boots and marched right over the page. This is about marching in the streets. The extant Tsujishi, and there are about 8 to 10 of them, of an estimated 100 to 150 that they made, our poem circle made. The extant Tsujishi are compelling examples of public art, specifically designed to get passerbys to pause, to learn about an issue, and then to do something. For example, to sign a petition against Japan's involvement in the Korean War. The street poem posters were also guerrilla in a sense, that one could tear them down from whatever pole, phone pole, electric pole, or wall and run away in case the authorities showed up, and the authorities were known to show up. The Tsujishi, I'm very happy to say, these are being currently translated into English, and I hope soon will be made available. So this will be another resource you can use along with the site. As local as the Our Poems Journal and this modest poetry collection may seem, the public information page of this first edition book that I showed you tells us that the Hiroshima Circle had strong connections with the outside world, and we can also see this in the pages of the journal. They were connected with peace movements and currents of Cold War politics outside of Japan. The publisher of the first edition poetry book that we saw listed the group itself as the publisher, but it also explained the Our Poems Circle as a branch of the Shin Nihon Bungaku Kai, the authoritative leftist literary society in Tokyo, and indeed one of the most authoritative bodies and publishers, journals in post-war Japan. Even more strikingly, we learned that the book had been published on the occasion of the Berlin Youth World Peace Conference of that year, 1951. And this was in East Berlin at the very early, at a very hot time of the Cold War. In addition, members of Our Poems circles engaged in another transnational and trans-ethnic action. They wrote poems in support of Zainichi resident Korean Union members. They participated in a strike, or at least showed up to support strikers at a nearby Japan steel factory in early 1951. And they were spoke out in support of the workers, many of whom were resident Koreans. In short, this Hiroshima poetry group stepped up to address not only their own local and personal concerns as hibakusha, but also broader transnational activist concerns and issues. Before the anti-nuclear movement had developed nationwide and worldwide, the poetry book and the journal reveals the roots of both local and transnational solidarity and activism. The poetry book, the journal, and the debates within the Our Poems groups about the pro-labor, anti-imperialist, and anti-nuclear agenda provides a window into the diversity of leftist art activism in the early post-war. Even though the governmental left, and here I'm talking about political parties such as the Japan Communist Party, the Socialist Party. Political parties is another thing that we've all in 2020 been thinking a lot about. So even the governmental left, these political parties had faltered by this time, by the early 50s, after their initial success right after the war. Toge and Shikoku remained members of the Japan Communist Party. Their writings and activism exhibit, however, an independence of thought and action from JCP directives. Although both Shikoku and Toge grew up in Hiroshima, their leftist education couldn't have been more different. Toge, an inspirational leader and mentor, was a Christian. He was a communist, but he had remained in Hiroshima throughout the war because of ill health. In contrast, Shikoku was drafted and went to Manchuria in 1944 as a soldier in the Japanese Imperial Army. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Shikoku spent more than 3 years in Soviet internment camps in Siberia, along with tens of thousands of other military veterans. He nearly died from cold, illness, and starvation during the first year of internment, but eventually recovered. Shikoku subsequently spent several years, close to 3 years in the Soviet camps, learning about Marxist-Leninist thought, the role of arts. He made posters, he worked on journals, he painted, and he interacted with and learned from other artists, prisoners of wars from Japan and from other parts of the world who were in the Siberian camps. In late 1948, Shikoku was repatriated to Japan, and that was only about a year before he joined the Our Poems group. The digital exhibit also, in addition to this historical perspective, I've also, for each book, included a page that talks about interest in these books today in 2020. This screenshot is about a recent revival of interest in the Our Poems art activism. And this has been going on for about the past 5 years. There have been various books published, exhibits, and in 2018, there was a revival of a 1960s play called Rivers by Tsujishi Kiyoshi, which is a play about a fictionalized version of the Our Poems circle, Toge and Shikoku. Tsujishi based the play Rivers on research he did in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, and he also interviewed former Our Poems members, including Shikoku, after he learned that the roots of Hiroshima activism could be traced back well before his own Vietnam War and student protest era to the early 50s, to the Our Poems circle. The second book in the exhibit, I'll be briefer about both of these books, is The Angry Jizo, published in 1979. This takes us forward 25 years. This picture book for young children, Ehon, has been republished dozens of times and is arguably Shikoku Gorō's most widely known work. And there is an English translation as well. Each generation has its historical moment, and for Shikoku, the 1950s Our Poems group was the moment for his generation to step forward as the vanguard, to imagine possibilities and to assert its vision. Although Shikoku, after the Our Poems group broke up in the early 50s, Toge passed away. After that time, Shikoku continued his activism. He marched in anti-war protest. He organized an annual peace arts exhibition, Heiwa Bijitsuten. He designed posters for constitutional study groups, and that's what some of these small posters are, because there were efforts to revise and change the post-war constitution from almost the moment it was promulgated. He designed book covers for books about hibakusha, and especially Zainichi resident Korean hibakusha. He visited elderly hibakusha and drew their portraits day in and day out throughout these years, the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. He and other members of the wartime generation of leftist and progressive artists had to learn strategies for resilience in shifting political, media, historical, and aesthetic environments in order to sustain their own activism and also their legitimacy. Since the atomic bomb poetry book of 1951, since that time, the world had witnessed the creation of thermonuclear weapons and a frightening competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to build and stockpile thousands of these apocalyptic weapons under the threat of mutually assured destruction and the logic of deterrence. Japan pledged to remain securely under its allies, the US's nuclear umbrella. By the 1960s, the global spread of anti-nuclear movements contributed to international treaties limiting atmospheric testing of poison-spewing nuclear devices and to inhibiting proliferation outside of the nuclear club. After a period of détente, geopolitical tensions among the superpowers led to nuclear posturing by possessor states, also to the development of frighteningly accurate delivery systems for nuclear warheads, and increasing anxiety about nuclear weapons. Media coverage of superpower defense buildup in the late 1970s and 80s focused on nuclear capability. Shikoku Gorō was not a hibakusha. He had been a soldier in Manchuria on August 6, 1945, but his younger brother Naoto had died weeks after the bombing, at sustaining injuries in the bombing when he was only 18 years old. Shikoku's mother and youngest brother were also hibakusha and suffered from radiation poisoning. In the early 1970s, Shikoku worked with many hibakusha in an NHK project of drawing their experiences of the bombing. In published essays from the 1970s, Shikoku also emphasized the transformative effect of reading the diary that his brother Naoto had kept faithfully as a mobilized youth in wartime Hiroshima, and that his brother continued to write between his the injuries he sustained on August 6th, the day of the atomic bombing, and the day he died, several weeks later. Naoto's diary was very important to Shikoku, and indeed, Shikoku credits his brother's diary and that reading when he first returned from the Siberian camps for his own lifelong activism. Out of this experience of the bombing and decades of activism and advocacy, Shikoku responded to the call to illustrate a children's picture book written originally by well-known children's literature author Yamaguchi Yuko, another committed leftist activist. And here we see two covers of the Angry Jizo, Kori Jizo. The cover on the right is Yamaguchi's book for third graders. It has much more text, but does have illustrations by Shikoku. And the cover on the left is the ehon, or the book for younger children. Here is the story of this picture book. In the troubling time when Japan was at war with many countries, a young girl found comfort each day in seeing the smiling face of a Jizo statue, a stone statue, a guardian of children and travelers, a Jizo in her neighborhood. On August 6th, she is injured horribly and finds her way through the rubble to the Jizo. Hearing the girl's plea for water and seeing the destruction, the Jizo smiles no more. He sheds tears into the girl's mouth, but she does not survive. The Angry Jizo's head shatters into 1,000,000 pieces. Angry Jizo was produced by a Tokyo publisher with a well-established line of children's books. The format is large and rectangular. I can show it here. Making it easy for adults and children to read side by side, or for an adult to read out loud to a group of other people. The question of audience arises here. How does one fashion a picture book about atomic bombing for small children? Shikoku himself spoke of the challenge of depicting what he called the most terrifying thing in the world for any audience, much less for young kids. For Shikoku, the bombing was not merely history. Even more than 30 years later, Hibakusha still lived in fear that they might be affected by radiation poisoning. And the arms race and nuclear testing raged on. This was a matter of justice and advocacy for him. Yamaguchi Yuko wrote the original Angry Jizo book, as I mentioned, for 8 or 9-year-olds. And when approached by the adaptation for younger kids, she was initially concerned that the core of her story might be lost in this picture book format. However, Yamaguchi saw urgency in that moment and decided to join the project. Quote, as one of the people who saw with my own eyes many people in Hiroshima perish that day, I know it is crucial now, in the late 1970s, now that we take every opportunity and employ every means to demand an answer to the bomb, to answers about the bomb. The publisher proposed rewriting the text printed with Shikoku's compelling illustrations into a katari or oral storytelling style with a tinge of Hiroshima dialect, with the help of well-known actor and storyteller Numata Yoichi. Yamaguchi worked with Shikoku and Numata to make Angry Jizo accessible broadly. I find the color illustrations that we've seen a bit sweet and pop. And sometimes I wonder if it was inspired by Iwasaki Chihiro's trademark style. But it's very accessible. It's easy to pick up. The pages in the book, however, the illustrations, they starts out after showing the girl and her neighbor. We see scenes of the Hiroshima in wartime before the air war has affected the city. And you can see this on the website. The atomic bomb dome is very small in the background. In this spread, Shikoku uses smeared watercolors in black and purple to suggest the moment of the blast and the force of the blast. He leaves the source of the energy release white to evoke the blinding flash or pika that so many survivors reported seeing. Like Shikoku's earlier works, Angry Jizo emerged from a creative collaboration among a group of people committed to the idea of peace education, or heiwa kyoiku. And here we see that peace education is mobilized for children and adults of all ages, and not only in the schools or on field trips, but also in the home and this intimate family space. This section of the exhibit about Angry Jizo can be used for teaching about peace education in Japan and also the notion of nuclear allergy. More recently, in the past 5 years or 10 years, Angry Jizo has found new audiences as contemporary activists took up practice of doing dramatic readings, rodoku, of the book to children and to adult audiences. Most prominent among these was actress Kiuchi Midori, who pledged to do something like 100 readings of Angry Jizo in different parts of Japan. This photo shows Kiuchi standing to the right of the screen with an illustration from the book and doing a reading, an oral reading presentation, a dramatic reading of Angry Jizo. And she's at the Maruki Museum in Saitama near Tokyo, in front of one of the Maruki's famous paintings, the atomic bomb mural. The digital exhibit includes a video, and I'd like to highlight this. Online on the exhibit, you can find a short video clip of Kiuchi's really compelling reading of Angry Jizo that she did in Hiroshima in 2019. Kiuchi also did a voiceover reading for a short film about Shikoku Gorō's brother, Naoto, and his diary, and Shikoku's own encounter with that diary. I recommend this 30-minute film to you highly. It was produced and made by Hashimoto Isao, and you can find the link to the film on my digital exhibit. Very sadly, Ms. Kiuchi passed away the day after completing the voiceover recording. I will touch very briefly now on the third and final book of the exhibit, Hiroshima Sketches. In anticipation of the 40th anniversary of the end of the war and of the bombing in the mid-1980s, Shikoku compiled sketches and watercolors of the city and combined them with short essays and poems. The book, a small paperback format, you can see it's a standard bunkobon size, and my cover is falling off. I've looked at it so many times. Starts with "Welcome to Hiroshima, Hiroshima e yokoso," to the reader. As a frequent visitor to Hiroshima myself, I found this book tremendously appealing. Shikoku takes us through the Peace Park, the sole destination of, in Hiroshima for many tourists, but then guides us away to the rest of the city, evoked in attractive watercolors that establish a sense of place. The copiously illustrated books gives a feeling of the city's many rivers and bridges, spaces important in the daily life of the city. Let's look at just a couple of the pages that are included in the exhibit. And note here that the Genbaku Dome, the A-bomb dome, the iconic dome in the Peace Park is very small on the cover. I think that's, Shikoku did that on purpose. Here's actually a spread from the book. And as pretty as nostalgic as many of the images in Hiroshima Sketches may seem, Shikoku strategically matches images with text in order to convey the layered history of each place. In this spread, Shikoku's text provides a glimpse into generational differences in visitors to the annual Toro Nagashi, or floating lantern ritual in August. And I quote from the text that you can see here above. "Older people enclose their sadness in the flames. Young people give light to the Hiroshima's spirits of peace and float it on the flowing river." One other page I'd like to point out from Hiroshima Sketches is this one. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, of course, has undergone several major renovations since its establishment in 1951. The East Building, built in the early 1990s, originally welcomed visitors in this opening gallery with extensive and really impressive exhibitions about Hiroshima's modern history before the war, about militarism and imperialism, and that led up to the bombings of Hiroshima. And then there was a panorama of the city 1 second after the atomic bomb exploded. As we see here on this page, a red ball hanging from the ceiling represented the nuclear device as a fireball. In this drawing, Shikoku shows museum visitors leaning on the railing around the panorama and notes that to people who take the trouble to visit from afar, doubtless have already learned about the destruction of Hiroshima. To truly know something, however, one must grasp it intellectually and with the senses. I understand this from drawing. In the panorama, there was something that summoned a single conclusion, regardless of country, religion, or ideological stance. Perhaps we can talk later about what that conclusion is. As a major part of the renovation of the museum in 2019, this panorama with the red ball was removed. It was replaced by a white panorama, which is a computer graphic projection of the bomb explosion and the city seen from above, based on aerial photos by the US military. And the last page of this book I'd like to share with you is this one. We're outside of the Peace Park, and Shikoku shows in this page and many other pages the multiple ways that the city of Hiroshima contributed to the Japan's empire, how it was a modern city, right? Building a strong military, industry, economy for more than half a century before the bombing, as well as the way that citizens and the state mobilized for total war in the 30s and 40s. In this slide, we see the former Army Clothing Depot. As a youth in wartime, Shikoku worked in one of these massive brick buildings where military uniforms, boots, and other supplies essential to the war effort were manufactured. Shikoku also illustrated the workplace newsletter when he was working there during the war. In Hiroshima Sketches, most passages narrate the entanglement of the built environment with broader imperial and national histories and memories, as well as local and personal histories. And I can't miss this chance to show this recent photograph of the building that we saw from the Hiroshima Sketches, which is now the subject of controversy because the government of Japan and the Hiroshima prefecture are planning to tear these buildings down. Several grassroots groups, however, are protesting this plan and propose alternate uses of this precious real estate and of these really important historical relics that are crucial to telling us about Hiroshima and Japan and the world's history. I'm short on time now, so I'm going to close now. And I would love during question and answer to talk about more about creative process and how that's conceived of as a way to develop democratic consciousness. And I'd also love to talk to you more about why I chose to treat this material on an online exhibit. I was very inspired by MIT's Visualizing Cultures website. So in conclusion today, I introduced a new digital exhibit, Arts and Activism in Postwar Japan. I hope that this exhibit will serve as a resource for teachers, students, and scholars interested in social movements, art, and politics and democracy. I used as a case study the work of Hiroshima activist Shikoku Gorō. Shikoku Gorō was not unique. Indeed, he exemplified the many citizens of post-war Japan who not only marched in the streets to advocate for social change, but who persisted day after day in writing a poem, painting a picture, performing music, and acting on stage, not just for art's sake, but as a form of social and political engagement. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions. Look forward to discussion.
Great. Sorry. Great. Thank you so much, Professor Sherif, for that super stimulating presentation. We have, if you've noticed, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So if people would like to think for a bit and pose any questions you might have for Professor Sherif, you can do so there in the Q&A, and we'll go through those in order. So starting with the first question. So Doug Slaymaker asked for the URL for the online exhibit and actually found and posted it. So thank you for that, Doug. Let's also imagine that I think it's fair to say, Anne, that you'd be willing to talk with other folks that might be interested in either hearing more about this or in potentially doing something like this with materials their own, that you might be willing to kind of talk about that process a bit. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think that all of us who are teachers and scholars increasingly find our primary sources online in digital form. And it was using myself, trying to contextualize those and think about how the internet can be constructive way to contextualize and help people understand and use those millions of digital files in a productive way. That was one reason that I wanted to make this particular online exhibit. And as I mentioned, the MIT Visualizing Cultures websites, which I'm sure many of people present have make use of, was one thing that inspired me. And in fact, I received valuable support and advice from Professor John Dower and his team of people who have made that invaluable resource. And I've also looked at University of British Columbia's Meiji at 150, because as the technologies and platforms evolve, people have figured different ways to feature digital materials and primary resources and contextualize them and analyze them online. And it's actually become much easier since the MIT Visualizing Culture time, when you needed MIT caliber computer people to be able to have a sophisticated site like that. And now it's not quite such a technical challenge. Although I must say that I was a content provider and a designer of this site. I had an undergraduate student, Max Mitchell, who was a computer science major, who helped me and worked with me, and also two staff members at the Oberlin College libraries who'd done a lot of work with classes at Oberlin College in developing online exhibits and archives and repositories with different softwares such as Scalar. That's the one I used. So it really does take a team of people to mount something like this online. One thing I am concerned about, though, is the sustainability of this. And there have been a lot of online workshops and conversations about this. For example, at Yale, I know recently they were discussing how we can sustain these as different platforms become obsolete, as the people who are managing these sites maybe retire or move on, as links are broken, and so on. So that's a really larger question, and it leads me to wonder what I can do to sustain this material and continue to make it available. One reason I did choose my college library and the wonderful staff is because I think as long as there are libraries, there will be a website. So I can put my exhibit there and it will be accessible to people all over the world and it will be there. But I've often thought of publishing this in hard copy, making another hard copy book. I've thought of, I have a PDF of it too, but that's a really big question, I think, for a lot of us working in the digital humanities.
It also strikes me that, in a great way, you mentioned kind of really trying to focus on, in some ways, the materiality or the kind of the move against the kind of flattening of these objects and how important that is. And I've used certainly the MIT visualizing cultures links, particularly around the Perry visit and so forth in class. And I was just struck in your presentation of how different the ethical stakes are with this material. And so what it means to be aware of that flattening and of people's hands or feet or these other things. I mean, the art itself is so kind of keyed into that, but how that changes the sense of what it means to preserve, when you're talking about hibakusha and this particular kind of theme or topic. Actually, the stakes are vastly different than they would be for kind of just, model trains and cannons and so forth, in other contexts. So yeah, thank you for focusing on that part. I really appreciated that. Another question in the chat then, this one's from Keiko Yokota Carter. She says, thank you very much for your presentation. I happened to see his paintings on Siberia experience in Tokyo in 2019. Because I learned about him at the small exhibition, my image of Shikoku Gorō is more about his life in Siberia. Would you have any comment on this part of his life and how it affected him, assuming there must be some kind of effect there? And thank you very much again for your research. I think it's very important.
Thank you for your kind comment and also for your support in my research and many people's research here. Librarians are important partners for scholars. Yeah, so there's been something like 20 or more than 20 exhibits about Shikoku Gorō's works in Japan over the past 5 or 6 years. And it's an incredible number. And one of those that you referred to was about his work, his time, and the art he created during his time in these Siberian internment camps from the end of the war of 1945 until he was repatriated in late 1948. There's so many things in that exhibit. There's a teeny tiny, speaking of scale, a teeny tiny, it's about the size of my chapstick or something like that, something called a mame nikki, a little bean-sized diary that somehow he got a pencil stub and paper, and he kept his little diary in some kind of shorthand notes, and he hid that, the story is, in his boots as he moved from, he almost died. He moved from internment camp to internment camp, and he wasn't supposed to be recording or documenting his time there. So this was another kind of guerrilla action, and he brought that back with him to Japan and used that as the basis of a 1,000-page, just incredible illustrated diary called Memorandum of My Youth, Waga Seishun no Kiroku, which was a fukokuban or reproduction of which was published by a Kyoto publisher, Sanninsha, and I think some of the libraries here in the States have purchased that. And this documents very carefully, and he wrote this in the months after he was repatriated to Hiroshima, while it was still fresh in his memory. But it gives a very vivid and a very unusual view of this time in the camps, the internment camps. He was a prisoner of war, basically, right? And the dominant narratives about that war, there's a lot written about this. I know there's Oguma Eiji, and I think some other scholars in the States have made available in English these different accounts by Japanese veterans who were in these. And the dominant narrative tends to focus on the suffering under the Soviet indoctrination projects, cold, malnutrition, hard labor, and so on. And although Shikoku experienced those things as well and writes about those very frankly, he also, in a sense, did not to be irreverent, a study abroad there. He encountered intellectuals in Japan and artists from other parts of Japan who were also vets, and had time to talk with them, to learn with them, to debate with them in ways that probably back in Hiroshima he never would have. He met prisoners of war from Germany, from, he encountered many Russian people. And it was this entire education about the arts, about thought and ideas, and about activism. So it was really a formative time for him. He had not gone to upper school. He graduated from middle school, and he taught himself a lot. He was a hard student, an earnest student. But this was a real education. So I highly recommend this account that he wrote about. I guess the only other thing I will say is that, and that I've been thinking about, is a lot of what's left of his work, in addition to these books, are hundreds and hundreds of oil paintings, of drawings, of sketches, of watercolors, and many of them were never exhibited. They were never sold, and they're in his atelier still. And he would repeat certain subjects, the Genbaku Dome. He went back again and again and again, 1960, 1962, 1970, you find him going back and sketching them and drawing them from different perspectives with different medium again and again. And I can think, why is he doing this? And what do I do with this material? It's interesting. But this is what I was suggesting briefly in my talk. For him as an artist, the creative process itself and that kind of discipline of experimenting, of trying new perspectives, seeing something from different perspectives and making it visible at different times and at different historical moments. That was part of his discipline, and that was part of him keeping aware of his social commitment and keeping in touch with those things that inspired him originally. And I think that's something that he writes about this in Wagaseishin no Kiroku. This is something that he learned partly there, this idea in the Soviet camps, the Soviets, right? The arts, this is not unique to the Soviets. The arts, expressive means, writing can be part of indoctrination. It can be part of creating nationalism, creating a citizen subject, right? And he internalized it, and that was part of his discipline and personal practice. And he did that through creative means, right? Not to show other people, not to have something to exhibit or display or sell, but the process itself, the creative process itself was really important to him in keeping that kind of democracy and radicalism, I think, and consciousness alive within himself.
Thank you for that incredibly learned answer response. It's really great. So we have several more questions I want to get to. One from Bridget Cooper, who says, why did they change the panorama with the red ball with images at the Peace Museum?
Hi, Bridget. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm really happy to see people from when I was back at U of N many years ago. It's great. Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't know how many of you have been able to see the renovation of the Peace Museum, which is very thoroughgoing, and I recommend it to you highly, but it's very different, and it anticipates a time in the near future when there won't be people who experience the war and the bombing. There won't be hibakusha there to tell their own story and to think of other ways of how we can tell and remember these histories. It also, I think, looks to, in the museum, to current technologies and museum practices in a very sophisticated way. And so, for example, using this really, I mean, you stand around what used to be the panoramic with the red ball, you know, which is kind of primitive and simple, but it, you know, for me, it really worked. I remember very well standing there and holding those cold railings and looking at that red ball and thinking, wow, you know, it was a kind of, you had to think with your imagination. There were also often volunteers there, local people who would talk about it and point things out in that physical panorama. I think that, you know, this one now, you stand there and it, there's, I guess it's, you know, I don't know exactly the technologies, but it kind of, it explodes there for you. It uses photographs and the kind of, there's this white flash and you're kind of engulfed by it. So, you know, I think partly it's a technological change, and they could do it. And they're thinking about changing audiences as well. What will 2020 audiences respond to? What do they expect when they go to the museum? So whether it's successful or not, I don't know. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. We have a question here from one of our graduate students, Lexa Molinari. Says, hi, Professor Sherif. Thank you so much for such a riveting talk. I was wondering if you could discuss the effects of post-war art during the period of 1945 to 1970 on modern activist art in Japan in the recent 20 years.
That's a huge question, but
that's a great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, and there are many people who are art historians who can speak more authoritatively. My training is in literature. This is my degree from the University of Michigan, was in literature, and I've added on the visual arts and visual culture, but. Yeah, I think I can say in terms of Shikoku Gorō's interest is he is someone, you know, older generation, the wartime generation, self-taught, as I mentioned, but he did keep in you know, read voraciously about current contemporary arts throughout his careers from the 50s through the early 90s. And I know he visited exhibits, he read journals. He was especially interested in European art and kind of canonical art, which is maybe a little ironic since he was not of the establishment and probably rejected by a lot of the artistic establishment. I think one thing that I can say is that his experimentation in using a range of medium, including collage, sketches, drawings, and so on, it was a reflection of his effort to keep in touch with contemporary art movements in Japan and around the world, global, because this is a global arts time. And to do something, and he did that especially because he wanted to keep in touch with his audiences. He wanted to think, what do my audiences appreciate and know? And also he found inspiration in the work of other artists. So that's a great question. I hope you'll work on that further.
You guys can talk more about that at the discussion later. Yeah, right. So Hiromi Mizuno thanks you for a fabulous talk. And says that she'll write to you later with questions. And then Professor Christopher Hill says, thanks for the talk. Could you talk about Shikoku's relationship with Ginsuikyo and other peace organizations?
What a great question. Yes. As somebody who was a lifelong activist and spent a lot of his time, as I mentioned, marching, collaborating with different, both mainstream groups like Ginsuikyo, and also a lifelong member of the Japan Communist Party. And I think he was part of those debates, right? Especially at the height of the Cold War, and thinking of what political stances people with alliances to different political parties had. My reading of my reading of his durability and the reason that he was so well loved locally among many audiences is that he was not doctrinaire in his politics. He had very strongly held beliefs and commitments, and he enacted those in arts, but I think he also recognized the importance of reaching out to anti-nuclear groups in the city and in their diversity, and tried to act as a bridge among individuals and different anti-nuclear groups. I found the Shikoku family has been really generous in providing materials for my research here, and I've seen lots of photographs of him in the Peace Park marching with Gensuikyo. And one thing I take away from those photographs, and also from his own writings, his diaries and essays about this, is the level of sophistication and the deep knowledge that people such as Shikoku and other people in these anti-nuclear movements in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had about the ongoing regime. Sometimes people object to the kind of victimization of narrative in Japan, and I'm surprised when I hear about it, because the critique, the sophistication of the understanding of the nuclear regime and nuclear weapons and what's at stake politically, globally, and how they're used diplomatically and so on, it's very, very high. And I think the discourse, in Gensuikyo and these other groups is also very sophisticated and something that we can learn from as well.
There's a question later in the questions about, I think, that victim narrative, but we'll go in the order just in case, but kind of keep that in mind. So one question is from Linda, Dr. Linda Ehrlich, who says, will this online exhibit be announced and promoted in other Asian countries?
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for your question. Yes, I very much hope so. I've been working at this point to bring attention to the exhibit in Japan. And some people have said, well, who wants to see an English website? There's too much English in it. But thanks to the support of some of my collaborators, we've gotten some media coverage in Japan for there was an article actually in the Mainichi Shimbun today about this exhibit. The local Hiroshima newspaper, the Chugoku Shimbun, has also published it, as well as some other media outlets. And I've also been trying to promote the exhibit as a way to study English and included a glossary for that reason. And so I've been talking to collaborators and other scholars in Japan about perhaps making a Japanese version. But Linda, I really like the idea of perhaps making this accessible more broadly, perhaps just in English, and bringing attention to this in other parts of Asia and the world as well.
Thank you. Our next question is from Miki Hirayama, who says, could you talk a bit more about Shikoku's relationship with the Communist Party? Did he collaborate with them, such as contributing to their publications? Iwasaki Chihiro, whom you mentioned, was a party member, and I also wonder if she and Shikoku had any professional relationship.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'll ask the last question first. I am not sure about whether he had a any kind of relationship with Iwasaki Chihiro. Of course, I know he was aware of her work, and there was recently a wonderful exhibit, kind of comprehensive exhibit of her work, partly at Tokyo Station and other places in Japan, I think in Osaka, maybe a year or two ago, and it really opened my eyes to Iwasaki Chihiro and how the breadth and the level of activism in her work as well. So I learned a lot from that exhibit. As for his relationship with the Communist Party, the JCP, I understand he remained a party member throughout his life. And some of his early works, he would sign his name, Gorō, in Cyrillic, because he learned, I guess, just kind of rudimentary Russian script when he was in the camps. So as a sign of that, his, that part of his past. he would sign in Cyrillic. But when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, as a way of kind of protest and saying, enough is enough, he stopped using Cyrillic. It was a small symbolic act. And I know that, that whole era of Stalinism, anti-Stalinism, and the vicissitudes of the Communist Party was something that he followed closely. I think he read the Akahata Shimbun, the JCP organ, all his life. But how else he was active? He did publish articles and contribute illustrations to the Akahata sometimes as well. So he did have an ongoing relationship with the JCP. But as I mentioned, my one reason I think he is attractive to many audiences is that he wasn't blindly doctrinaire or dogmatic, while maintaining his critique.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions, I think. We have about 10 minutes left. So this next question is from Tanya Mouse, who says, thank you so much for this. So excited to learn more. As you were talking, I jumped up and located our Shikoku Gorō volumes on the shelves. I heard you discuss books as book objects. Given the increased digitization, including that of the National Diet Library in Japan, do you think that books only exist now for analysis as objects and artifacts, or do you think they still hold value for research? I'm sorry, and there's a slight, I guess, again, addendum, which says, in a sense, it implies a shift or transformation for libraries and archives into museums as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya. And I want to recognize Tanya's really valuable work at the Wilmington Peace Center here in the state of Ohio. And I attended her wonderful symposium earlier in the fall. So thank you for your work. And you also have this really valuable collection. And I hope someday when the pandemic is over to drive down to see your collection. And I guess that's a way of saying, yes, I think that there's real value in having museums and archives and libraries in maintaining access to physical objects, despite or precisely because of digitization. For some of the reasons that I mentioned, the physicality of the book tells so much that in digital form that we can't see. No matter how high resolution a photograph is, there's certain things about the physical object of the book, and that might be the smell, might be the quality of the paper, it might be marks that something happens to differently when they are digitized, that researchers really and students really need to see with their own hands if these are things that they're focusing on in their research. Having said that, having these digital versions available broadly is just such a rich and wonderful thing for our teaching and research, especially in pandemic when we can't go there and pick those things up. And I also understand that for conservation reasons, that you don't want too many people handling those books. So I think libraries and physical collections continue to be really, really important. And books don't require any electricity, and they're the most stable media technology that we have. Yes, thank you, Tanya.
Thank you for that reminder in this kind of high-tech kind of Zoomified world, especially. So Liz Smith says, wonderful talk on an emotional topic. Thank you. And Leslie Pincus writes, sorry to have missed the first part of your talk here on the West Coast, and hope I'm not asking something that you covered in the talk, but she said, I'd like to know whether there are any records of children's responses to Shikoku's picture books on Hiroshima.
Hi, Leslie. And Leslie is another scholar whose work has inspired me in so many ways. Yeah, that's the reception of Shikoku's books is really a significant one. The kind of evidence I have, and this is not a children's response, but I do know from the publisher of Angry Jizo, Kin no Hoshisa, which is in Tokyo, that they've in the past 30 years. They've reprinted that book more than 80 times, 75 or 80 times. So people are reading it, and we can also assume that it's an ehon, because so that it's not just a single reader, it's a group of readers maybe. We saw Kiuchi Midori reading to adults and young people and children, and there are other people who do that as well. So there is an audience. I'd be really interested to learn, and perhaps this is something that the publisher of Yamaguchi Yuko's earlier edition too, and the ehon could share with me, because Japanese publishers tend to send out those postcards if you have a physical book saying, you know, what was your impression of the book, and so on. So that's a wonderful possibility for further research, and I'd love to learn more about the reception there. Thank you, Leslie.
We have another question from Lexa, but since you guys are be talking, I will leave that one. So we have, since you got one question in already. But then I think then our last question will be from David McCormick, who says, thank you for your excellent presentation. You noted Shikoku Gorō's opposition to the official narrative of Japan as victim. Can you elaborate on the nature of Shikoku's view of the role of Japan with respect to the Hiroshima tragedy?
Hi, David. Good to see you again. Another alum. Thank you for watching and for your question. Shikoku Gorō described himself after the war, when he could look back at his youth in retrospect in many of his writings and his diary, as a gunkoku seinen. He was a young boy who had grown up thoroughly indoctrinated in the militarism and the total war times that was part of his education and his youth. I spoke already of the transformational experience of the Siberian camps. But after he came back, one thing he grappled with as an activist was precisely, his positionality, his position as a vet, as somebody who had gone to the front, who had been a soldier, who had believed in the national mission, the imperial mission. And he, in his writings and in his art, he sought to refute that, to write about, to criticize fascism and militarism, right? So he used his voice to speak up about that, to reflect on his own responsibilities, and to think about how he, as an individual, and other people, and other artists especially, and people in Hiroshima, could forge a different future and not go back to that past. So one of the things he encouraged was knowing history, the importance of knowing history and learning from history. And that was a lifelong effort on his behalf, but he was very, I think it was a struggle too, especially as a member of the wartime generation, right? In the 60s and 70s, with the youth movement, with the student movement, and criticism of that older wartime generation. There were times when he fell silent, right, and tried to think about how he could be useful and relevant, and move forward with hope. Thank you.
We have a couple more questions, but it's just about at time. We're at 1:29, and I want to respect people's time. So what I would say is that, first of all, and we'll send you the questions, so if you'd like to respond to folks. So I see particularly Nicholas Scalatano has a question, for instance, and I'd encourage you guys to get in touch with Professor Sherif. Michael, you're a graduate student, and you can talk to Professor Sherif this afternoon, along with Lexa at 2 p.m. Write to Peggy Rudberg and Barbara Kinzer. We look forward to seeing you and hearing your questions then. Joanne Quimby, hi Joanne, says she's excited to use your exhibit in her upcoming J-term class on literary artistic responses to Nanjing and Hiroshima. So she's thanking you for that, because this has already become a pedagogical resource. So I just wanted to maybe close on that. So thank you so much, Professor Sherif, for this wonderful presentation and the reminder to kind of always keep in mind the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and the links that you made helpfully and not always subtly, but really valuably, I think, to our current political moment and thinking about kind of how these things connect. I think it's super valuable. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Professor and Cher. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. It's great to see everyone.
Our pleasure. Absolutely.
Stay strong.
Yeah, indeed. Take care, everyone.